That's how you do it.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for coming to the Big Questions panel hosted by the Philosophy Club. The topic for today's conversation is metaphysics and consciousness. Could we have each panelist introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Hart?
Just a really brief.
Yeah.
I am George Hart and the director of the library here at UMass Lowell. Say more? Or?
No.
Okay.
Sanjeev Manohar, chemical engineering professor here.
Tom Hersey, professor in English and in honors.
I'm Chris Phillips. I'm in the philosophy department and teach some of you ethics.
I'm Peter Weston. I'm in the mathematics department. Teach mostly calculus.
The first question is, can any emergent phenomenon be reduced to its fundamental parts? Are tables and chairs as real as their constituent particles? And it's 20 minutes, sorry.
20 minutes each? Or?
Yep. Well, 20 minutes each question.
Each question. I'm kidding. Should we just start
Yep.
casually? I think they can be. I think maybe it depends on the phenomenon or phenomena with which we're dealing, but we can kind of think about it this way. Maybe sometimes they shouldn't be. I guess it depends on what our purpose is for trying to understand these things might be. I'm thinking, for instance, right now, the seat, I'm not thinking about the seat as much as I might be in 10 minutes, where knowing what what an emergent phenomenon in terms of a seat might be. Yeah, I think as we work through some of these different questions, I think it'll be interesting to see how we think about not just the question itself, but why we're asking the question. Maybe the spirit with which or in which we're asking the question might determine how we think about these things.
Just my take on that is it's important in the sense of where it's pointing us. The idea of reducing things, of looking at the parts of things, explaining, is very much that kind of like I think William Blake called it single vision and Newton's sleep to some extent. And I think personally, this is everything I say is just personal opinion. We need to enter an age of systematic thinking, of complex systems, system dynamics. And I think if you look around 300 years of science, it's just been hyper-specialization, knowing more and more about less and less. And William James called it the PhD octopus, kind of taking over the academy. And so when I see a question like this, I would say, why not look for the integration of parts into systems, and why not focus on that rather than try to look at the reduction to single or simpler causes?
I think I answered this question for myself when I was a kid. I used to say the whole is more than the sum of the parts. That sounded reasonable to me when I was a kid, so I've never really thought too much about that question. Well, I shouldn't say that. I guess I don't value that question as much as what George just said. I liked what he said when he said the word integral. I do think there's things that are emerging that can't be reduced to its parts. And I totally agree with that idea of integral, that I think the future is to see how we can take parts and integrate them. I'll even take that a step further. I have a book here called by Gene Gebser, and he talks about the difference between perspectival and aperspectival. All right. So perspectival consciousness is focused on one thing. All right. It's wonderful, but when you're focused on one slice of the reality, you're not seeing the rest of it. So he's made up a word called aperspectival, and the prefix a should be translated as without. without giving exclusive validity to a single perspective. And that thinking has dominated my thinking for the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years can't remember when I first started thinking about this. So that's what I'm always looking for. I'm always looking for how do you take multiple perspectives and integrate them into a whole. I'm talking right now, so I must say one more thing. All right? He gives an example of Picasso's painting to illustrate that. So I don't know if you're a fan of Picasso. It's an acquired taste as far as I'm concerned. But when he paints a model, he painted women a lot. All right, he paints them from multiple perspectives, and it's as if in his imagination he walked around the model to get different perspectives. All right, and then he puts them into the painting, and I'm assuming that you've become a fan of Picasso. When you watch that, you can see immediately, there's an immediate perception of the whole, and the parts are right there. They're not there in sequence, but they're right there. And then I think that's a clue to the kind of new consciousness we need to look for. All right, it's integrating time. So he walks around the model, that takes time, and the result of all that is concretely realized in the painting. So in my own life, this is what I'm trying to do in my late years. Is I walk around, and how can I have a concrete expression of time in my own thinking?
Well, can I go for it?
I think there are a lot of ways to unpack the question, right? And I especially appreciated Dr. Hart's initial way of putting it in terms of part-whole relationships. That be a little technical, a little bit of the academic philosophical vocabulary. Questions of Mariology, the relationship of parts to wholes, is an interesting and difficult question, and certainly talking about systems is a way to begin to think about and maybe cash out what Dr. Weston is getting at, with something being more than merely the sum of its parts. But the trick is, of course, how do you, to borrow or misuse phrases from a variety of sources, how do we carve nature at the joints? How do we get systems? You might think it's easier with the artificial. I suggest maybe it's not even easy there. But we can look at a variety of examples in recent history of science and just begin to worry there that we, for the sake of medium-sized objects, by which we mean everything from planets to tables and chairs, aren't very good at maybe coherently carving things at the level of a system, or even knowing what we mean by a system, or even knowing what parts count as what objects. Think about the move in biology from a traditional understanding of species and genuses to talking about clades and cladistics, and that this more accurately represents something about the world. Well, are genuses and species not real? It does speciation, the slow change of one species into another. How do we count those objects? The object of being a member of a certain species, to be that kind of thing, that kind of object, how do we carve that in a way that is intelligible, that has discrete meaning? Planets, as a medium-sized object, maybe is another one to worry about. Are planets real? I don't know. There are certainly advocates of Plato. Maybe most of the audience doesn't care. This happened in what feels to you like ancient history. Maybe for most of the panel, we grew up knowing, as a matter of fact, there were 9 planets in the solar system. At least 9. Maybe there were more we didn't know further out in the Oort cloud. But now, of course, there are 8. Is this a matter of definition, or do planets exist? Is there something really at stake here? Depends on what a system is. If that's how we're going to try and carve holes out of certain parts and not others.
Thank you. Well, I'm an experimental nanotechnologist. So my experience with the emergent system is when in the lab, we had a reaction. We had A and B, and we know how A behaves, we know how B behaves, we know how A and B behave when they react to each other, we know all that. Yet when I added them in a certain way, I got something that was completely, shockingly different from what was expected of A and B. And so at that time I didn't have any idea as to what to term that. So when we published it, we called it emergent nanostructures. And so this particular definition is very apt from that perspective, is we could not have predicted when you mix two things together, or people together, or thoughts together, there's a critical concentration or a critical value above which something new and weird goes on. And so I've been thinking about this, what is causing this? I think what's happening is when you have X number of entities, they are surrounded by their environment with definable physical properties. When you make that X squared, X cubed, completely new properties emerge with completely unpredictable properties. And the reasoning for that is this tendency for the universe to always be disarrayed. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a system with small particles, with environment that defines it, there's a lot of symmetry there, kind of symmetric. But when you put a lot of them together, they conspire and say, wait a minute, we don't like this symmetry, because symmetry is inherently constraining. So they want to break the symmetry. And so it completely, that's an emergent phenomenon. It only happens when you have enough number of stuff, particles, or people, just like crowd behavior. Individually, people can be very rational, right? When you put them in a crowd, the emergent properties can be hooligans, right? Or they can become great, whatever. So this emergent property, that's when I saw that question, these are the things that come to mind from my own experience when I see molecules, people, systems interact. Something phenomenal happens. Just like what happens when you clean clothes. When you take soap molecules, put it in water, doesn't clean, doesn't clean, doesn't clean. All of a sudden, it becomes a gangbuster cleaner. It starts making bubbles, right? If you look at really what's happening at the molecular level, when you have enough number of soap molecules in the water, they break the symmetry and they become micelles. And that's what cleans it. So that's an emergent behavior. So that's what I wanted to share with you, that unexpected properties can emerge from well-known sources. It is very surprising. So maybe that would provide a different perspective, an experimental perspective.
Should we continue?
Well, Professor Manohar was a chemist with Procter & Gamble.
Yes.
Once upon a time.
That's right. Tide. We made Tide.
Do you want to move
Does
on?
someone have a
Continue
question?
with this question? Or?
Whatever you guys
You can
want.
ask a question.
How does that relate, how do you guys think that relates to the layering of reality, say, between physics and chemistry, or between like quantum mechanics and physics? Because this is about how emergent properties imagined happen, and you were talking about how when there's a certain amount of stuff, things change. There are some modes of thought that say that you can't relate one mode of science to the next when you get to a certain level of complexity.
Yes. Okay, if you want to take, you're asking.
I'm asking
the panel.
the panel.
With respect to the quantum mechanics and that abrupt change in properties as you go from the quantum level to the macro level, it is commonly misconstrued as a emergent phenomenon.
Yeah.
That is not the perfect definition, because at the quantum level, it's different. It's not like as though many quantum particles get together and become weird. It's the laws of physics are very different in that, and there is a transition from a micro quantum to a macro level, but it's not an emergent quantum. Emergent is something that, like traffic patterns, each car can go in a certain way. Put them all together, weird things can happen. You know, one exit or one entrance can completely slow everything down, right? Anything viscous and viscous liquids flowing through a pipe can display emergent properties, which is not seen when it is flowing freely. So, from that perspective, even the way we think about, maybe the next question will take us into that. If we want to get to the nature of reality, and as we ponder into the mysteries of the universe, as our thoughts become more and more cogent, more and more concentrated at a certain level, at a certain concept, you can expect emergent phenomenon going on in your mind as well. Maybe that's for the next question. But it's just a phenomenon in nature that nature wants to break symmetry. And so when I found that out, I said, there is a reasoning for it. The reasoning is freedom. Everything wants to be free. They don't want to be symmetry and constrained. They want to break the symmetry. So maybe that kind of alludes to what you're saying.
Isn't that an old theme? I think I'm getting something from my youth. I remember being told that out of chaos, order emerges, but then the order breaks down and cycles back to chaos.
Exactly. Yes.
On certain interpretations, certainly, Heraclitus can't step in the same river twice. That everything is change, everything is flux.
But there's a logos throughout it, right?
It's, I guess, the great advantage of only surviving in fragments is that you can be the fodder for anybody's pet theory. And Lynn borrowed authority to it. So I'm not sure about Heraclitus per se. I think that there's something interesting in thinking, maybe again at medium-sized object level. I'm a bit worried about the anti-mechanistic tendency. I'd want to unpack more perhaps what we mean by freedom or wants to break symmetries. But I think there are clear ways we might think different levels of explanation must be true. And at least in certain parts of professional philosophy, we try to maybe do a little bit better than emergent, try and get a bit more precise. And oftentimes it's put in terms of supervenience. And this gets a bit technical, but supervenience is roughly an asymmetric relationship where a change in the thing that is supervening on requires that there's a change in whatever that substrate is, but it doesn't have to go the other way. So for example, this is presumably made up of physical constituent material parts, and now there are fewer. Have I destroyed the tablecloth? No. Indeed, we might understand, and this certainly I think will come back up when we come to the philosophy of mind, and worries about reducing or even eliminating the mental in terms of particular brain states. Multiple realization, the way that the right-hand side particles and the left-hand side particles, you could just swap them. It's not clear that that would change or destroy or make for a new cloth, because the cloth can be made up of any number of arrangements of its constituent material chemical pieces, just like the same brain state, or rather the same mental state, could be realized in any number of different distinct neural patterns. And we might think you can't reduce, even if there is a deep dependency relationship, right? An ontological dependency. Maybe you can't have phenomenological mental experience without there being brain states. But to say that this thought is that particular brain state might just be to mistake these kinds of levels of explanation. Right? Similarly, with these medium-sized objects, is this object just adding up all the microstates? Well, not if we can add up a different set of microstates and still count it as that object, like through erosion. I haven't destroyed it. I certainly have changed its microstructure. I could destroy it, enough erosion would, But what allows something to persist and survive certain changes over time and not others seems to be a question of systems, maybe how those things integrate into objects, what we count as objects, quite apart from how you might want to reduce it to a matter of chemistry or physics for that matter.
You have a question?
Is that a question?
If you had a question, what would it be?
Did you have a question?
I was going to say, like, in the realm of, like, specifically the tablecloth, you break it down, it starts to become a quilt. It starts to be something different, but keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's certainly an interesting wrinkle, let's say, tongues firmly in cheeks, to ask how objects can become other objects. Notice that if you're a reductivist, you at least are spared that question because it's just a different arrangement of the micro states. But that's to eliminate an interesting question for the banality of, I don't know if quilts or tablecloths exist. I just know that there is a succession of Heraclitan micro states flowing one into the other.
The next question.
Sure.
Is there such thing as non-material existence? Is only the physical real?
I just have kind of a comment on the, because that struck me as a boundary problem. It's sort of our minds trying to find a boundary. And as a librarian, we always throw out the idea of, data to information to knowledge to wisdom. We're always struggling with that. And one of the interesting definitions of knowledge is recognition in the OED. It's one of the earlier ones. It's the idea that, and they even use examples of two warring bands. They recognize an enemy and they have knowledge of the enemy. And I think our minds often seek boundaries in the way that we seek, is the way that we seek knowledge. So so the question is, I mean, not to brush over the question, but when you start off with the idea of things, how things are connected, you're looking at what's interesting philosophically is the connections of things. So gravity is a property of mass for a while. And, how we sort of what. Again, I'm just getting back to this idea of how we recognize things and apply a word to it. It's just another interesting book thing is that we often think of Bibles as the first print book that kind of overwhelmed Europe. Everyone wanted to have a print Bible. But before there were print Bibles, the most common, and actually long after print Bibles, the most common book in every house was a book of plants, was a herbarium. Originally, they were done with woodcuts, and then they were mass printed. But more homes in Europe had these plant books than had Bibles. And it was that they needed knowledge. They needed to know the boundary of what, because actually, especially as plants were starting to move across borders from the New World and into different countries. So these are questions we're supposed to have answers to. But the difference between the idea of discrete physical and non-physical, I think, for me is not something that that I sweat too much. I just enjoy reading how science tries to make more sense of the cosmos.
When Brendan asked me to be on the panel, I said, I'm not sure you want me. I'm not really a formal philosopher, and I don't have a lot of interest in doing that. But I do have interest in consciousness. And he said, well, come and tell us about consciousness. So the question here is something that's immaterial. I would say that consciousness, I would bet that everybody in the room would say I'm conscious. All right, so is that conscious? Is that material or is it immaterial? So the question that I like to pose to people when I'm talking to my students, if they're willing to talk about this, I like to ask, where does consciousness come from? All right, and I find that most people don't really think too carefully about that. all right, including myself until a few years ago. But the standard answer when you do probe somebody is that it's a property of the brain. It's a byproduct of the brain. So consciousness is immaterial, the brain is material. So how does that work? So I've been thinking personally, I'm not trying to say I'm right, I'm just telling you what my personal resolution of this is. I think consciousness is primary. I think somehow the material world emerges out of consciousness. And one question that I recoil from when I get is like, well, what do you mean by consciousness? Define it. Well, if I have to define it, that means I have to stand outside of it, and that's not what I believe. I believe I'm in consciousness. I think we're all in consciousness. I think we swim in consciousness. So that's what my particular interest is, and I can say more about that, but I'll let other people talk. If I get another chance to talk, I'll talk more about this book, The Emergent Structures of Consciousness.
Can I just throw a question? Is that sort of an animist perspective, that the universe is somehow alive and conscious? Not really.
Consciousness is primary. I can't prove that. I'm just saying that's what makes a lot of sense to me. I did bring some props with me. This is the DVD. I don't know why I bring it just to hold it up. But it's a guy named Peter Russell. By the way, when I first saw this, I saw that as two words, quest ions. Because the ions is not the chemistry ions, but it's a meaningful acronym. Okay, there's a place out in California called the Institute of Noetic Science, all right, which I like a lot. I'll go off on a track if I do that. But Peter Russell worked there for a while, all right? Now, Peter Russell, as a young man, worked with Stephen Hawking. He's a brilliant guy. He knows a lot of physics and got into graphics and computer science. But he's been struggling with this consciousness idea. And this is, I think, about an hour and 5 or 10 minute lecture that he gave to come from a physics point of view to the ultimate conclusion that consciousness has to be primary. Now, I can't do that argument for you. You can watch you can borrow the DVD if you want. But I don't know, it makes a lot of sense to me. I guess I should stop there.
I can go on about this. Yeah, there's, I think, a lot to say here, not least of which is to think that consciousness is primary is in some ways an old and venerable tradition, to the extent that certainly philosophers have wrestled with and have arguments for an immaterial soul. This is old, certainly as Western philosophy, if not older and found in many older traditions. But to the extent that Descartes is taken conventionally as demarking the move from the Middle Ages or the schoolmen or the medieval philosophy and the modern period, because philosophers think 1650 is modern. His meditations start from exactly there and argue that if anything is certain, it's consciousness. And in fact, it is far more certain that you are aware of something than anything you might be aware of. And that to privilege phenomenology, to privilege consciousness as certainly more credential, more certain, is, I think, a perfectly legitimate place to start. Now, how I think it best interacts with this question is it just maybe flips it on its head, but still we have to ask, are we monists? Are we dualists? To think that consciousness is privileged might just argue that, or to ask, is there material substance? Is there material stuff? Why not just go full idealist? George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, argues as a hard-nosed empiricist, all we really have access to in the world is how it impacts on us, and we're made aware of it. We might magnify that, we might augment that with all kinds of instruments, all kinds of technology. But ultimately, even that's just conscious experience. So why not have an ontology that's based on things as the intersection of the way we experience it. And maybe we can guarantee that our various experiences coordinate, there's an objective world because, well, he's Bishop Berkeley, and you can imagine that there's at least something that's always conscious and can keep things on track. Guarantee that our worlds don't spin apart, frictionless and separate one from the other. But you might also just push this question back a step further and worry, why talk about ontology? Why you could be a monist and still ask, is there a difference between mind independent, or maybe usually referred to mere physical properties? Are those distinct and separate from mental properties? You could be a property dualist and think some kind of anomalous monism. You could also, I don't think it has to be animist. Maybe animism is a version of it. You could be a pan-psychic. You could think all matter actually does have mental properties too. Probably not all conscious, certainly not all conscious in the same way, but I don't have access to your mental state. Maybe none of us have access to the tablecloth mental state. But we may have good arguments that, as a pan-psychic, we know there are mental properties. Do we know everything that has these properties? Maybe, maybe not. But I think there are a lot of ways you could unpack this question where it doesn't have to go to the level of different kinds of substances. That's certainly a way to try and understand the world and what's in it. Another way is just, well, let's talk about the properties and what we mean by a mental property and how that resists maybe a reductivist or an eliminativist account in non-mental terms. That what's irreductive here is the content, the meaning, maybe the intentionality of what we privilege as the most obvious thing. Right? I'm aware of having this thought now that seems to be about a material world, but the material world is much further down the justificatory track. And so maybe we have to, if not privilege, certainly make some sense of what the mental properties or stuff is.
I also think that this goes back to what I first mentioned. I think, what is your motivation for asking these questions in terms of, when you mentioned Descartes, for instance, why he may be privileging something as a greater type of certainty than another in terms of not just what perhaps might be primary, what I can't doubt, in terms of clear and distinct ideas and his method and so forth. But I think it's also interesting that there might be kind of a sense of maybe a univocal approach there that sees kind of a wholeness as of greater value in terms of determining what something is versus something else. And maybe then dualism becomes is seen differently than if you see maybe separate but not perhaps maybe reducible to the other. Some of the questions, some of the points you were making before in terms of how we think about how things change. And I think that this is also related to this question of how we understand how different sciences have different ways of going about thinking about what it means to be intelligible. Privilege, I guess, in sense of kind of what is integrity and what does it mean for something to be integral. There can be many ways of understanding that too. So yeah, I think it's very interesting in terms of what monism might mean to one thinker versus another, and so forth.
Yeah, it's a very big question. It's like okay, let's answer it in 2 minutes, right? There are systems of thought that I've been also struggling with since I was a very young kid. About when I was an adolescent, I wanted to run away from home and join a monastery. Wanted to become enlightened, etc. In that phase, I did some thinking about this exact question. Is there anything other than material stuff? There are philosophical systems of thought that start off with consciousness being the first entity from which everything emerged. Science, at least modern science, seems to push back against that and say that, wait a minute, this thing exists, whether you exist or not, whether your consciousness identifies that as that or not, this still exists. So that battle is kind of old, and that dog doesn't hunt anymore. Because if you look at stuff, look at things in the world, and either look at distances, right? I mean, distances is what perhaps defines matter. There are distances between here and there. There's distance between an electron and a proton. Do a thought experiment. Either you can reduce, cut it in half, cut it in half, cut it in half, right? And you can reduce it to infinity, right? Infinite number of cuts, or you can't, right? There's only two. Either you can cut the distances infinite number of times, or you cannot cut it infinite number of times. Let's take case one. If you cut it infinite number of times, the infinite cut, the last cut, will have zero length, right? Therefore, you then add them all up. 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. You start off with this, some distance, but 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 doesn't give you that distance, right? It's still 0. So obviously you cannot cut it infinitely, right? Right? Take case 2. Okay, then you cannot cut it infinitely. You have to stop at a certain point, very small point. If you think that is the truth, then well, that point also has a distance which can be cut, right? So both can't be true. So both scenarios, that you can take distances and cut it infinitely, can't be true. And the fact that you cannot cut it infinitely also is not true. But yet everything exists in distances, and therefore everything that exists is untrue. So this is another way of using logic and reasoning to arrive at a conclusion that points to the fact that everything you see is an illusion. It's just a construct of the brain in order for us to provide us some survival mechanisms to move to the next stage. So as humans evolved, we were throwing bananas at each other just a few years ago, right? We came down the trees, we started learning equations, all stuff. And now we are trying to look at the universe and try to understand what is this stuff. It goes on forever over there, and I look down into smaller and smaller, nano, micro, pico, it goes on forever down here, right? So we are somewhere stuck in this middle. We are trying to rationalize, does this exist or not? More and more I'm thinking that nothing exists. Everything that exists is in non-material. And that's my, at least at 59 years old, that's where I am. Again, 60, I'm not sure. Okay.
That doesn't mean you don't have to do your homework.
That's right. Can I just follow up a little bit on that? A lot of this about existence. None of us asked to be born or planned, right? We didn't fill out a questionnaire. We emerged, we were pushed out of a womb, and human hands grabbed us. And a certain period of time later, we breathe our last, and other human hands close our eyes. And in between that, we work so hard to hold our shit together. In other words, to see ourselves as unique, as somehow integral beings. Because if you think about where we began and where we end, how much of that is, how much is real, how much is different, how much is separate? Now, of course, there's no answers. That's personally, though, that's my plug as an undergraduate philosophy major. That's my plug for what you're studying. It really is a way to be free in a lot of ways, and ultimately to have a lot more choice, and ultimately, hopefully, to find some degree of peace. That's just a little personal aside.
Want to do the next question? Or
Sure, we can probably go back to some of these points.
Do you want to?
No.
Okay, just making sure. What is the nature of human consciousness? What is the relationship between the mind and the brain?
Why are you looking to me?
Because they look at me.
I don't mean to sound wise guy, but I think I gave my answer in the previous question. That where does consciousness come from? I don't think it's an emergent property from the brain, or as Talia Deschanel says, an epiphenomenon. Right? And I've come just personally to my own perspective on this, that somehow consciousness is primary And then I don't try to dwell on that. I'm not trying to understand that. I like to go beyond that. I don't know. I have a whole bunch of things I could say, but I have a feeling it's not this question, so maybe I'll defer to other people if they want to talk.
I would just say that these questions all run
Yes,
together.
right.
They really do.
I thought you were brilliant.
You know, it's just kind of one big, for you to spend your lives, pondering. It does seem, I did, after Brendan sent the questions around a week or so ago, I was, and again, this is maybe trivial, but a lot of philosophy is just observational. I watched my two dogs that we went for a walk, and there was a little briar patch, and the snow had melted, and clearly they smelled rabbits, and they stopped, and then they looked at each other, they made a few noises, they were moving around, and it was, I realized that they probably, their senses were telling them when last a rabbit was there. Maybe was it a young rabbit, an old rabbit, male or female, was it more than one, had there been a fox crossing the path. So there was a real sentience, a real mind there, and it just struck me that given a species given enough time might be able to belt out the word rabbit based on this long evolutionary period of sense of survival. And so I tend to, although, so I tend to, it's like you were saying about objects in the medium, how if you're big enough or small enough, things change. So at the organismal level, as an organism looking at each other, I do think our minds are a product of evolution. I think it's the matter in our skull that is forming the words, that is shaping a lot of that. But that said, everything else is an open question. This being that can belt out the word rabbit doesn't know jack, really, about anything else, about the whole cosmos that we're in. So at one scale, we have this kind of, what is it, or this, we're measuring things, we're watching things, we're seeing things. It's all sense. And then at the other scale, we know enough to question all of it and to say, do we, what's real and what's not real. But just the last piece is that sometimes when you keep pondering this, you end up with a sense of a universe unfolding. With Richard Feynman said at one point, he was thinking that maybe the universe is waiting for him all along. And there is a way to look at the cosmos and a way to think on that scale. Of course, we're so insignificant on that scale, but it's also very heartening. It makes you feel good to be alive when you can reflect on things like that.
There's a spooky thing about consciousness that I wanted to share with you, since the word consciousness is there. Remember the experiment of correlated particles that was done in the 30s. When apparently there's a particle that splits into its particle and antiparticle with opposite spins. They go off on exactly 180 degrees from each other at this close to speed of light, away from one another. The funny part is one is spinning this way, the other is spinning that way. Not really. One could be spinning this way, the other could be spinning that way. If it's going clockwise, then the other is anti-clockwise. Okay. The quandary is, it's not as though it starts off going this way and remains that way forever. It is whichever direction it's spinning depends on when you measure it. If you measure it after 2 years, you might say it's spinning clockwise, because the act of measurement is what determines its spin, right? So maybe a microsecond later, had you measured it, it would have been going the other way, because 50-50 chance. But here comes the spooky part. But once you measured it, you know the spin of the other particle, right? And that particle can be light years away from you. So the question is, since nothing can travel faster than light, how does the other particle know that this has been measured? So this is a very weird thought experiment, and it's been proved has been experimentally determined that yes, that's exactly what happens. There is instantaneous communication between this particle and that particle through the universe. That's one part. This is a well-known experiment by Fermi, Bohr, and Einstein, etc. in 1932 in the Solvay conference. But for this discussion, the spooky part for me is if it is possible for the fate of particles to be determined by a consciousness observing many, many, many light years away of its sister particle, what about our fate? We are made of particles. Are our fates being determined by people observing many, 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 or consciousnesses observing even without knowing that they're observing it? Just like you're observing me, you're observing the universe, right? Maybe you're sealing the fate of something many, many light years away, right? So it becomes scary. So your act of observation is what determines this fate of the universe, not just that, okay, I observed a particle. You're determining this, you're sealing the fate of something really, really far away. And so are we all subject to this collective consciousness observing, and is that why we find ourselves in this hole, that we try to make progress? There are so many impediments to progress. Perhaps this is the question of whether is it fate or is it your own hard work, right? I mean, is it fate or chance, or is it, can you make your own future? Maybe you can make your own future by hard work in some areas, but in some areas your fate is determined by someone observing really, really far. I mean, not even someone, something observing something, and it has to be conscious, right? An experimenter who determines the spin to be plus half consciously records that yes, it's half, right? That's when the fate of the other one is sealed. So consciousness seems to be at the root of everything, and that's the spooky part.
I think it's interesting to think about how the language we use affects the way we think about these things. I remember years ago learning that in some languages they only had one word for both consciousness and conscience. And in both senses, that they had to do with the knowing with, but there's a different kind of sense of awareness and so forth. And I also think that throughout time when we talk about a soul, perhaps when we talk about a self, or what it means to be selving or mindful and so forth, and I think it's interesting sometimes to try to use some of that language to put it on things that maybe we typically associate with being more material than our own experience of consciousness. So for instance, a tree in many ways kind of selves, right? It's got its own way of being, it's got its own way of kind of communicating to those things around it and so forth. But our own way of kind of selving is different. George's dogs are mindful in some way, but in terms of kind of self-differentiating, or the way that we're mindful of self and mindful of others, I think that's different. And so, we think about what it means to be not just looking at things as they're intelligible, what it means to be intelligent, right? To be making these types of distinctions and so forth. I think it's interesting to be kind of, I guess, a little humble in the way that we think about how we go about kind of thinking about what we mean by immaterial. Do we see things somehow superior to these other things that don't have it, or maybe just a different way of being? The other thing I was going to say is, George reminded me of one of my favorite professors, Bob Kusendorf, who taught here for years. Bob Kusendorf taught psychology, great guy. He said when he was on his, when he was earning his PhD and studying the mind, one of the people on his board asked him if cats have minds. He said, that's the wrong question. You should ask me if cats think mice have minds. He passed.
So, just continuing to think of the von Neumann-Wiener interpretation that consciousness has this possible impact on the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. I worry that the story there actually, if anything, argues quite the opposite. Not that there is this immaterial mental substance, distinct from the material, distinct from the physical world, precisely because of what's oftentimes called the interaction problem. If there's material and immaterial substances, the worry is in the interaction problem, what, if anything, do they have in common? If they have something in common, can't we break down this dualism back to a kind of monism? And if they are just different ontological kinds, well then how does a mind do anything to a body, and how does a body give you any access to the world? But the story here presumes a solution to that problem. And I worry that if we just take that interpretation of the measurement problem as given, that if anything, it doesn't show that there's an immaterial substance. It shows that there is a perhaps inadequately unpacked and explained, but a material substance that we call the observer. That the observer is having an effect determining the physical world. Does that make it no longer a material substance? And maybe, as I suggested before, perhaps we don't have to worry too much about it. There's still the hard question of, well, okay, they're the same thing. Maybe we don't worry too much about collapsing into ontological monism if we still have to worry about property dualism. Right? There is something still unique and in need of careful unpacking, and seems to resist a physicalist property account, call it the observation. You know, what is it that the awareness of a measurement does? Okay, but that's awareness looks very different than anything the unaware might do. So I'm just, yeah, you know, I think that the interpretation, and there are a variety of other maybe as interesting alternative ontological interpretations, such as, well, awareness just tells you which of the many worlds you're in. I'm not sure that's better, because now it's maybe a monist world, but there is a plentitude of monist worlds, all of which don't connect and branch off perhaps at these quantum moments.
Quick question, when you're thinking about the way the mind, the consciousness can affect the matter and so forth, I think that there's certainly, in experience, they seem to be porous to each other. But that doesn't, I think it's interesting that we can kind of look at them as separate ontological in some ways, right? But they don't have to be, reduce one to the other. Again, that's what I started by saying, we can reduce it to one thing, we don't necessarily have to.
Yeah. And whether it's at the level of ontology or property, I think even maybe harder might be at the level of semantics and meaning.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways, I'm inclined, maybe because of my own interest, maybe because I think we can get to a harder version of the problem, is to turn it on its head and ask something like, how do we get the world in our head?
Right.
And, you know, not to bring it unduly back to some of the first comments from Dr. Weston, thinking about the Picasso, I think, can be quite informative. You know, to the extent that we're representing the world, there has to be a moment where what we're talking about, insofar as it's a representation, maybe it necessarily misrepresents, fair enough. But how do we even get the accurate mind-world connection? It's one thing to have in the head rattling around a lot of these conceptual interconnections, but unless it grounds into some medium which keeps us all on track, it's not clear that we can mean the same thing or that we're talking about any other aspect of the world. To the extent that we, as conscious beings, are the way the universe can be aware of itself, it's still a mystery what it means for anything to be aware of anything else. What is it to ground at some point this maybe very intricate web of interconnected concepts? You might want to say something about ostension. I mean that, and you do something like point at it. But there are a variety of problems and puzzles that arise in what seems a straightforward solution. I guess that's one of the meta lessons with philosophy. The more straightforward the attempted solution, the more likely it is to give rise to all kinds of problems, not least of which sometimes we put this in terms of the Frege constraint or the Frege problem, is that you can mean very different things. Or the very same part of the world you are trying to point at can present itself in such radically different ways that to make sense of the different cognitive content presents a real difficulty. If I were to say, just to give the most crude gloss of Frege's sense and reference, right? If I think that Hesperus, right, the evening star, is occupied, right? There is a star where there is alien intelligence, but I think of Phosphorus, the morning star, that is a barren rock. I may have all kinds of reasons to think that, but I am pointing to the same thing, but I'm not clearly uttering a contradiction. I'm not being irrational. How does, if we want to get the world in mind, and we can't even just point to something and think that we're getting it and not just some representation, some way it presents itself to us, something that's already open to interpretation. And this is to get back to the Picasso. Oftentimes, abstract painting is contrasted with so-called representational painting. It's meant to accurately represent the world, ignoring the fact that it always misrepresents, at least spatially, trying to get the 3D world onto a 2D surface, right? Just look at a map. And in alternative ways, a map might be a projection onto a flat surface. The world looks all kinds of straight parallel lines, but if you were to actually try to draw it out, it has to be warped at the edges, because we are doing something active and interpretive in understanding the world. And in fact, you might think Picasso more accurately represents at least an aspect of the world. I like very much the way you put it. This attempt to make concrete time. Why are we going to privilege space? But it's a bit of a mystery. What kind of references we can make, or what kind of meanings we can extract that get out of our head and into the world are, I think, anything but obvious. And there's, that's part of, I think, the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that these mental content attached to non-mental things, whether it's the thing thinking or what it's thinking about, for that matter?
Again, when Brendan asked me to be on the panel, I warned him that my interest is consciousness studies, and I'm not sure how this fits into the philosophy. But when I was looking at the questions, I've got a library of books, and I looked at the questions and tried to see what triggered my mind and what books I might bring. I don't know, it's like one of the things I like to do. So in my experience, I think I can make a contribution by sharing a little bit here. This is a book called Beyond the Brain, so I think the title certainly relates to the question. The author is Stanislav Grof. He's a man, he's past 85 now, I think he's 86, 87, but still alive. He's from Czechoslovakia. He was communist when he was growing up, and he was working in a lab that was sent some LSD by Albert Hoffman, and said, you might want to test this. So the thing, the rule in the lab was that if you're going to do human testing, you have to do it on yourself first. All right, so he took a dose. In those days, they didn't know what a big dose was, and took a wicked big dose. They were doing some strobe light experiments, all right? So just as the LSD was kicking on, the strobe lights went, and he said he went to the other edge of the universe. Right? He said he was a devoted atheist and came back a devotee of Shiva. But anyhow, that's a cute story, but the point is that he spent the next 17 years of his life doing rigorous research on LSD before it was prohibited. Right? And what he noticed was there were 4 categories of experience. Right? The first one is what everybody knows, the aesthetic, colors, sound, shapes, things like that. He didn't think that was therapeutic from a therapist's point of view, I guess. The next one was biographical material would come up, all right? My understanding is that Freud said psychology starts when you're born, all right? He didn't acknowledge there was psychology in the womb. So the third category of experience that he was able to relate to was birth experiences. And there was quite a few experiences around that. And finally, the fourth category was that there were experiences that seemed to be beyond the boundaries of the ego. Okay, I don't know if I want to use the formal term ego, but beyond the boundaries of the individual. They were having experiences that related to things that had no relationship to them. There's stories of people speaking a language that they had no formal training in. So there's something in the universe that humans can have access to, even though it's not part of their own story. When LSD finally became prohibited, he and his wife were out in California, and they tried to find something that was equivalent to what they found in LSD. And he's come up with something called holotropic breathwork. I've done about 60 of those sessions, and still working on it. But those breathing sessions, it's not an exact fit, but I wouldn't want to say that with the LSD, but the kind of experiences that people have during those breathwork sessions are very similar to this. So that's something in my personal experience that I thought I'd share and see if you found it interesting. Beyond the brain.
Any questions, Johan?
So this has more to do with sort of the meanings that we assign things, but I don't know when a good time to ask it is. So
You're looking at me, you asking me?
I'm asking the panel.
Oh, okay, I couldn't quite hear you, go ahead.
So
meanings, not meetings.
Yeah, meanings.
Meanings, okay.
So, for example, like the dictionary, every word inside it is defined by all the other words that are also inside it. And yet, we're able to use language effectively to describe the problems that we're talking about. But how is it that the meaning arises, considering that everything's defined in terms of everything else? And I think that, just to extend on that a little bit, that can be extended to the mind-brain problem. Because it seems that we're talking about, well, the mind is something that affects the brain, and yet the brain also has a relationship to the mind. So when everything's defined in terms of everything else, how can we untangle that?
Define. What do you mean by define? Say what something is once and for all, or is that kind of a...
Well, I guess
understand?
another way to say it is like restated, because if you have a math equation where one side is written using different symbols than the other, then that might be an example. So I can swap out like synonyms,
Okay.
and yet it's equivalent.
You want to take a shot at it?
Give it a shot.
Short answer is you can't. When you're born, your parents, you have to survive, you know. So at that point, the baby doesn't really care about the nature of consciousness, etc. It just wants to survive. So based on the immediate survival needs, it makes certain associations. Oh, it's food. Well, this is warmth. And so if the parent reinforces that, yeah, I love you, so if the baby or the child associates a good feeling with that word love. From that point on, that becomes the nucleus from which other words, you see what I'm trying to say? It's that word, even though the word love doesn't have any meaning to the baby, it associates a warm feeling. And that's, I think, that's where language starts for the child. And so the long answer to your question, it is intricately related. You're right. If you're an alien species coming in trying to look at the definition of consciousness, it's defined as something they'll never be able to find out. Okay, but if you're born into the system as a child, as a baby, I think words get very clearly defined because it's survival. That's my thinking.
Just a side thing, my baby brother and sister, they were child number 4 and 5. They had their own language, and the youngest really could not communicate with the rest of the family. You had to talk through number 4. And it seemed to just, my mother, I think, was in a period of postpartum depression. You have 5 kids under 6, But they really did. They had to be brought out into the school to break their language. The family, we didn't break it, they kept it. I always used to wonder if they'd had a dictionary of this old language that they created. It's all astonishingly wondrous, just everything, every moment. If I could just, I don't know what the time is, but I just wanted to thank Brendan and thank all of you, and say that you are inviting me, this impact, you were saying, in the universe. So we are going to, I was thinking, the library is going to subscribe online to the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books at the minimum. And we're going to push books onto the homepage, because it just occurred to me how much, there's a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow that's had a big impact on me. But the thinking slow, the real thinking in our lives does take place in books, whether they're e-books or print books. And the choice you made studying philosophy, what I found in my life is that it freed me from worrying about vocation. I've never worried. I started out pre-med, and there were some tragedies in my family, and it was my philosophy professor who talked me through the worst of it all. And so I switched majors. And since then, I've never worried about what I'm going to do for a living. I mean, I focused on books. I trained as a printer, then as a bookstore manager, and finally as a librarian. Just been drawn into this space. And because of you including me, thank you, in the panel, I'm really going to try to do more. We have an $11,000 gift that we just got from a retired engineering professor who said there's not enough philosophical activity. And so he said, I want you to set up book displays in the libraries with my gift. And so we're going to do that. So we're going to really try to, because of what you did, we're going to try to create this practice of more philosophical thinking. Let's try to strengthen that on campus. So thank you.
Thank you. That's an emergent phenomenon. You had a question. You had a question, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So, just from a purely physical standpoint, we all experience our own version of reality through our brains. Do you think that we are all our own consciousness experiencing our own realities or are we all experiencing the same reality as a group of consciousnesses together?
Perspectives.
Yeah, I actually see a kind of connection actually between these last two questions, insofar as maybe we should point out that we silently slid from discussing metaphysics and ontology, what exists, the kinds of substances, maybe the kinds of properties, into epistemology and asking, and perhaps also philosophy of language, which is maybe a place that does nicely intersect between metaphysics and epistemology. How do we move from, I think the nice example of interdefined words and concepts to those having a meaning? And maybe this is a more extreme version of this worry. Is there only the subjective? And what would keep different, otherwise frictionless, spinning, free subjective worlds on track? And you might think, what the same thing that might ground a language as not merely one of an innumerate number of perfectly coherent, interconnected set of, but meaningless, at least having no objectively real meaning, set of concepts. It is hard. It's not at all obvious how it works, and to the extent we can recapitulate, whether it's the empiricist or the rationalist, whether we are a tabula rasa where our very first primitive concepts get imprinted on us, and there are associated spillings of ink or compressions of an atmosphere that we associate with that, certain sounds, certain symbols that we then build up into words. Or some of that maybe is built in, right? Is there certain grammar, is there maybe certain conceptual apparatus that we just inherit built in and allowing us to parse the world? Is it the world that determines the fundamental structure? Is it reason or the mind? Is it some kind of combination of both? But at some point, it seems that the answer to both these questions, one hopes, is something like we can mean, and we can get it right, we can get it wrong, we can be justified, or be entirely at sea and be wrongs, but we could be bullshitting, we could be saying false things, we could be wildly speculating. But all of that in the space of sometimes we mean what we say because things we mean are out there in the world. And they have their representational place in the head too. There's something that corresponds. I intend to say something about that dog, right? That dog, I suspect, wants to say something, even if they can't, about rabbits. But notice how this answers the dictionary question. If all you have is the dictionary, and we can imagine being in this situation, maybe we discover some long dead civilization and all we have is the dictionary. It's not like it hasn't happened before. See the Rosetta Stone, right? Here's a language with interconnected symbols. Clearly means something. In fact, here are 2 or 3. And it isn't until we have one where, okay, now we can attach meaning to those symbols and have an understanding of its grammar interconnecting those symbols and bootstrap that up into an otherwise completely opaque conceptual, or in this case, linguistic scheme. But that, I think the Rosetta Stone is a nice example of what you are objecting to or worried about with the dictionary. You're right. If all you have is concepts and none of those concepts ground in either non-conceptual mental content or something about perception or some way the world impacts and gets in the head meaningfully, then yes, it's not clear how any of those arbitrary interconnected linguistic or conceptual units can be grounded. A dictionary by itself can't tell you anything. And similarly, we might hope that the words we use, that when I say by a dog, you understand because you make a similar sound and it connects in the same way, that we both accurately model the world, does require a fair bit of argument. I mean, first, maybe you have to grant, at least if I'm polite, that you have a mind. And, you're not just the thing I'm experiencing, right? Maybe we have to, and there are things to say about how you overcome the problem of other minds, that there are versions of this, like the inverted spectrum. Maybe we just can't answer, and there may be good neurological reasons to suggest, yeah, what I mean by blue is not what you mean by blue, but we're ultimately still talking about this surface. Even if the blueness of the surface just means different things for us, at least it connects in all the functional ways, so that we're talking at least about the same thing. Other things, there may be a fact of the matter about whether that's a dog or a really funny shaped fox, and we could get it wrong, but at least we understand, broadly speaking, in the usual conditions. When I say a dog, I mean that thing, just like you do.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Yeah. I take your question in a different direction. First of all, what's your name?
I'm Dylan. Hi.
Dylan?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Peter. Nice to meet you.
Usual.
Here's my point.
Yeah.
We didn't know each other before this session, right? You right?
Yes.
We never met. So you said it's what's in my consciousness and what's in some other's consciousness. Is it our own individual worlds, or are we sharing something? And that was your original question, wasn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah. So here's where I would take that. I would point out that consciousness is convergent. All right. Now, where I got onto this, another book, Teilhard de Chardin, The Human Phenomenon. His basic thesis is that evolution is directed, and it's directed towards increasing consciousness. All right, and that it's convergent. So convergent. How do you explain convergence? Let's say we had a more extended conversation and we kind of really got to know each other. I'm pointing out that you can't undo that. Okay, once I have some sense of who you are, because you, through language, shared it with me, there's a sense in which you are now in me. And of course, if I'm talking, then it goes the other way. So I think that's really interesting. If someone like Teilhard de Chardin says that evolution is directed towards consciousness, increasing consciousness, okay, that then gives me something to live for, all right? I'm always trying to see if I can increase my consciousness. And a great way to do that is to interact with other people, all right? So if you and I interacted, there'd be some increase in consciousness in both of our beings. But Sanjay, am I saying your name right?
Sanjeev.
Yeah, I think you said something really, really interesting at the beginning, all right? When you were talking about, through your research, you know, you pair a couple things and you see something, but then you didn't use the term critical mass, but that's what I heard, right? If there's a critical mass, then something really happens, right?
That's right.
And see, I think that's what's true at the human level with people getting together. The last part of Teilhard's book is called Super Life. The last part is called Super Life, all right? And the first chapter in that part is called the collective. The way out is the collective. I forget exactly how it says. The collective, the way out. So I think that's the future. I think the future is how do we create more effective collectives among ourselves, all right? And then talk about these kind of issues, life issues, all right? And then I think if we could hit some kind of a critical mass of enough people getting together and talking about these kind of things, okay, then I think a new structure of consciousness might emerge. So my other book over here, Gene Gebser, says there's structures of consciousness that have emerged over time, and he calls them mutations. And he names there's 4 major mutations, from archaic to magic to mythical to mental, and there's a dimensionality. Archaic is 0 dimension. I think he's trying to communicate that the original humans probably didn't see themselves as distinct from the other animals. All right. Then there was a mutation, adds 1 more dimension for the magic. I associate the magic with your story, Sanjay, of the 2 particles, you know, light years apart, but can react instantaneously. So he defines magic consciousness as 2 points are equivalent. And he gives a story of a pygmy tribe on a lake in Africa. Early in the morning when they're going out for a hunt, before the sun comes up, they draw an outline of the animal in the sand. And at the first ray of light, throw the arrow into the sand. And then there's evidence that later in the day, when they went out and did the physical kill, that in their consciousness, those 2 points were the same. So, the mythical consciousness is storytelling, and that's where all of the world's religions have come from. All right? And then that structure of consciousness became deficient. All right? And then we have the axial age with the Greeks about 2,800 years ago, I think. All right? And the mental structure of consciousness emerged. And that has progressed over time until we have the modern age. And I liked how you said the beginning of Descartes. I kind of marked Descartes as the beginning, too, of science. All right? Am I going on too long?
No.
All right. I think this is a critical thing, is to kind of get what he's trying to say about these mutations of consciousness. The mental consciousness with the Greeks was a more balanced kind of mental activity. But what happened over time is there was a dividing, all right, and a fragmentation. So I think all of modern science has been achieved by breaking big problems down into small problems. So that's a great thing. Science has done tremendous for human beings. But there's a thing that comes with that, which is fragmentation. So Gebser has this concept of efficient expressions of consciousness and deficient expressions. So what happens is when a structure of consciousness emerges, it's efficient for a time period, and then it becomes deficient. And then from that, a new structure of consciousness has to emerge. So even though I love science, I've made my life on science, right? Well, math, if you want to call that science, right? But there's this byproduct of fragmentation, and I think rational consciousness has become deficient. And by deficient, I mean insufficient to solve the problems that we're facing. So what I think is that rational consciousness is about dividing. All right, so in mythical consciousness, you have more of a polar balance. All right, there's opposites, but they're in kind of balance. I think of the yin-yang symbol as kind of a mental thing about that. But what mental consciousness is came in and divided. Okay, the Greeks were very mystified by irrational numbers. They thought everything should be rational. Ratio of a circumference to a diameter is not rational. You can't divide the pieces up and have it go in an integral number of times. So I think the essence of rationality is division. Wonderful, it's given us science, but it's also given us fragmentation. So Gebser says that this rational consciousness has now become deficient. So what has to emerge is a new structure of consciousness, and he's calling it this integral aperspectival consciousness. So that's where I am right now. Where I am sort of philosophically, if you can say that. I don't think of myself as a philosopher, but I am concerned with the way the world is right now and what kind of problems that we're facing. I see an awful lot of sadness in my students, all right? And when I quiz them on it, I get this sense of they can't articulate it, but this underlying sense of the fragmentation in their life, and they're not quite sure where they're going with everything. There's pieces that they don't quite see or feel add up to some kind of whole. Now the kids that I teach, there are a lot of kids that are pointing to jobs that are going to pay well. So I don't think it's as much of a problem for them. I just want to share one thing too, that with this whole consciousness thing, I don't know if you've heard this before, but there's a quote attributed to Einstein that said, "No problem can be solved with the same consciousness that gave rise to the problem." Now, I really researched that because I love the quote, and it's not a quote. Okay, it's a paraphrase of something that he said after he worked on Fat Man and Little Boy. Are those the two bombs? Did I get the names right? Yeah, those are the two bombs that fell on Japan. What he knew was the power of those bombs, and he said, if human beings don't do something with their consciousness, this is going to be used for mass destruction, and of course we've seen what nuclear bombs can do. And I think that a new structure of consciousness has to emerge to be able to overcome or supersede, I love that word, that's one of Gebser's words, supersede the deficient rational consciousness. I don't know when to stop, I should just stop.
I have a question about Professor Manohar's suggestion that nothing exists.
I knew I was going to get that.
So I have like two, they're not inconsistencies with things you said, but inconsistencies with things that you might agree with. So I'm going to first say that I think that's incompatible with Descartes' cogito ergo sum, because that's an assertion of the existence of a self. And then the other thing is, how would you justify a moral code if you believe that nothing exists?
Okay, that's a very large question. The moral code, as you define it, I don't know how you define a moral code, but what I think you define is, are you thinking of an absolute or a relative? The answer depends on that.
Any way to rules that govern behavior.
Yeah. So if you have a society, think about if you want to live as a collective, there are ways to live productively and there are ways to live destructively. One that makes the society stronger, empowers people, empowers the weak, empowers the elderly, right? So there is a code that you try to inculcate in your mind, saying that if I did action A versus action B, action A leads to a more cohesive family unit, tribal unit, society unit. And if that's what you mean by moral code, that comes from the survival itself. A tribe that has a moral code has a greater chance of survival because it is stronger. So, given that we have these five senses, and we have to operate in this world that we notice, that we observe. Again, I was saying, we were not thinking about these things. We were on the trees, And now we are now human beings. I mean, we look at books and say, what is going on here? What is this universe? We are wondering, right? And science tells us that if you break this wallet into pieces, it's empty space. If you go to the constituent atoms, it's still empty space. You break that, it's empty space. There's emptiness everywhere. So the question is, if everything is empty, why does it seem real? So it's a conditional reality. Based on this specific set of eyes, and I see this. But if I had a different set of eyes, I may not see it at all. So from that perspective, it doesn't really exist. It exists as long as I have these senses. For this particular set of configuration, it exists. But that was not the question. You're asking whether it exists. Is there something beyond that? That's one. The second part is, I wanted to dovetail on what you were saying. You mentioned consciousness. Are there different consciousnesses, or are we share a similar one? And then I think you have a very, very interesting response as to how you can go to the next level of consciousness. It's becoming more synthetic rather than divisible. But what I have found is very helpful is the technology, how you do that. One is the technique, or one is the principle that consciousness has to emerge into higher and higher forms. But what is the technology behind it? What do you do today to do that? One aspect you mentioned was the chemical modification, that is using chemistry to do that. The other is breathing, right? The breathing techniques. Breathing techniques does change brain chemistry. There is another way, which I think is very interesting. I don't know if you have heard about phantom limbs. Folks who have lost their limbs, they still feel it. And what has happened is that brain area that the limb was servicing becomes now, it's like fully furnished apartments, right? No one's living there because the limb is no longer there. So what happens is regions surrounding that area invade and take over. So denying sensory input to a specific part of the brain allows regions around the brain which have other functions to invade, and so you become extremely mathematically gifted, or become extremely violent, or whatever area is there around it. You have amazing capacities to perceive. So one way to go to the next level of consciousness is, one is through chemistry, drugs, right? The other is through breathing techniques. The third is to intentionally deny sensory input into your body, which is what meditation is, right? Think about what is meditation? Why do people do meditation? And why does it take some time before you can see remarkable phenomena going on in your brain, right? It could only be that, all right, I'm going to just cut off sensory input. So slowly what happens over time, regions around start invading, right? And you start altered states of consciousness. So so that's a technology for taking consciousness to the next level, above and beyond an accidental hit in the head, or drugs, or techniques such as the breathing techniques called pranayama, right? So there are multiple ways in which you can alter consciousness, but all that there's a basic behind it. In order to do all that, you need to have peace, right? You need to have a society that's peaceful. If you're always worried about your next exam, or someone upsetting you, or of a war, or of a stock market crash, that creates imbalances in your mind that you don't have time for all the stuff. So it's very most important thing to establish first in your life is peace. If you're taking 16 credit hours, cut it down to 12, Have some free time so you can invest some time into these technologies, which are probably far more permanent than a potential A in your class, right? So what I'm trying to impress upon you is invest in these technologies. It's okay if you don't graduate in 4 years. Take 5 years, take 6 years. It's okay, But if you make inroads here now when you're young, imagine it's a compounding effect, right? When you're 60, 70, 80, you'll be much further ahead than me, So that's an idea.
I wondered how much you have to step forward to step back. Like, if you have no frame of reference to take things away from, then what are you left with? And I also wonder in the question of peace, like there's the possibility of like getting a concussion and then having a violent reaction if you don't have a peaceful environment where things are taken away from, that maybe bad things will rise.
Yes. So what I was trying to suggest was, if you are having a restless life, if you're a restless person by nature, right? What it predisposes you to slow growth in this, whatever we're talking about. You will not be able, you will have a longer time identifying what consciousness is, evaluating it in a meaningful manner, because you're restless. You all of a sudden something scratches, you got to do something else, you know. If you're that kind of a personality, I'm suggesting that the best technology for that is to use meditative techniques, use slow breathing. A lot of techniques available. Go to YouTube, you'll get lots of wonderful techniques to calm the mind. If you calm the mind, your mind is the monkey, right? That's the one that keeps throwing the monkey wrench. Calm the mind first, then the consciousness will emerge. Otherwise, it's just intellectual exercise, right? I mean, you go out of the room, you forget, yeah, it was interesting, consciousness, great. You forget about it, right? Because the mind is now the monkey. It doesn't want you to do that. It starts giving you all kinds of impediments. So first thing to do is to calm the mind. And then I think the consciousness will emerge, I'm sure, and you can actually work on it by denying sensory input, by doing meditation, and that's the next stage. There are lots of YouTube videos available on meditation as well.
These are just really wonderful thoughts being expressed. It brought to mind, there's a philosopher named David Beckett, B-A-K-A-N. He wrote a book, The Duality of Human Existence, and he reflects on agency, which is, you know, from that birth to death, it's me being here, you being here, it's all these things that we do. In some cases it's our restless minds. So reflects on agency, but then he says that a good life is when our agency is directed toward communion, basically toward a converging consciousness or a communal goods, as you said, a society working for betterment, for a new kind of consciousness. And it really gets back, you know, to the questions that we started with. You know, we're separate, we're pulled apart, we're a separate ego, a separate entity, a separate consciousness. And we really work hard on that. Calming the mind, following the breath, looking for different ways of being conscious. There's also ways that we can be just applying our agency toward communion. And I've always found in my life that the connecting piece for me between my agency and my sense of communion or achievement or whatever is actually philosophy. It's actually it's the ability, it's the freedom to think freely, to calm my mind. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful gift. I'm always coming back to how happy I am to see you here. And how happy I am to be here.
Yeah, just the last one quick comment. By calming the mind and going into your mind, not meditating, you're also not corrupting the universe by constantly observing, right? So maybe that's why it's working.
We can probably take one more question if anyone has one. If not, then
Just a quick comment. I was
Is this the
thinking.
last question? Or is there more?
he has a comment.
Just quick comment, trying to clarify something in my own mind too, in terms of language. I was thinking about the fact that you can discover Rosetta Stone or something and so forth. It's interesting that certain languages that developed at different periods of consciousness and so forth, oftentimes, you know, they articulate a way of being in the world different than they point. They for instance, to stay within the world, try to understand some of these questions. And like the example of Picasso, in some ways, they allow us to think about time differently too, and we can kind of articulate what we think about ourselves in the world in ways which I think maybe allow different types of philosophizing to take place to begin with. So different ways of thinking about ethics, different ways of thinking about epistemology and so forth. A lot of times, I think, get back to this very question about, meaning and how we communicate with each other. And actually, I think in some ways allows us to rethink what we might mean by, again, the relationship between what we consider to be together in terms of community and consciousness, but also what we might mean by the relationship between what we consider to be immaterial, however we translate that, in the world of material, or aspects of the world of material. So it's a nice way a lot of these things come together when we slide from one discipline to another.
So is there another question after this, or is that? Is that Mr.
It was just 3.
I think there's
That
just
was
three.
all.
Three's
Oh,
good
yeah,
enough.
there's no more like
Okay.
questions, yeah.
So I had one thing that I wanted to bring up that was slightly off topic, about the origin of consciousness. And I was reading something. I did not read the book, but I was referenced Origin of Consciousness and the bicameral mind. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. The idea that the consciousness as we know of it did not come until 1,000 or so years ago, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, around the time of the Iliad, or a bit afterwards. And the author
Thank you.
points out that in the Iliad itself, the way that all of the main characters move is by the will of the gods and not by any movement of their own. And later on, a couple hundred years later in the Odyssey, the main character of the Odyssey, obviously, very much, even though he does get pushed around by the gods, has his own will and tries to do things on his own. And that because of how the left and the right side of the brain work, that they were not properly communicating with each other until somewhere in that time period.
I can give you if you
Julian Jaynes' breakdown of the bicameral mind. I don't think it's taken as a serious historic or psychological account, but it does have some interesting, if you want, philosophical or narrative features as a kind of meditation on what it is to be self-reflective, to the extent that a lot of what we're talking about with consciousness is mere awareness. There's at least 3 senses of consciousness, and we can dispose of one relatively quickly. In a few hours, you'll be unconscious, but you'll be fully aware, at least part of the time, of these vivid hallucinations we call dreams. You're not unaware, you're conscious of dreams as you're unconscious. All right, that's relatively a straightforward distinction between being asleep and conscious and being awake and conscious. Self-consciousness, though, is, it seems, a different animal, tongue again firmly in cheek. What maybe distinguishes us is an ability to reflect on not just that we have thoughts or that we have an awareness of the world, but that we can then have a reflective stance on that we can think about whatever it is we're thinking. We can be aware that we're aware and begin to draw distinctions, begin to try to understand and be aware of the world in a different way by being aware of how we're aware of the world. And I think that Julian Jaynes is trying to say something about that, trying to distinguish between a voice that is indistinguishable from just acting in a sense unawares, that you may have an inner voice that you take quite literally as the voice of God, is like those impulses that might be quite sophisticated, that we might want to articulate in conceptual language, but we haven't yet hit that insight that that voice is my voice, that we have alienated that voice. We can imagine that there could be periods where communication happens before you realize that you're communicating with yourself when you're thinking. And so that voice you might otherwise externalize, hey, there's an enemy over there, let's, not get killed together. That might come, communication by voice as an external way of coordination, might be internalized without our being aware of it. We might begin to see and coordinate our action as if from the outside. But of course there's no one around, so it must be some kind of spirit or God that is our agency until we, at some point, make that kind of cognitive breakthrough. Now, whether we want to say that bicameralness, right, that way of talking one alienated part of ourselves about the more immediate, less self-aware part, probably shouldn't be reified as right hemisphere, left hemisphere, except maybe metaphorically. Besides all that, I would highly recommend, it's a very lesser known book, Harry Turtledove. Anyone know Harry Turtledove? He writes a lot of alternate fiction, alternate history fiction. But he has an early book called Between the Rivers, where he very explicitly imagines a Mesopotamia where exactly this is happening. This moment of Julian Jaynes' breakdown of the bicameral mind, and what that might look like as a bit of alternate history fiction. Right? There are those who do think the gods are commanding them to do certain things, and those who are manipulating them, and then those who are secretly, in some ways, not just unorthodox, I guess it's heretical. When you begin to say those gods aren't gods, they're me. Keep it to yourself, and it gives you a kind of advantage because you can resist certain manipulations from a priestly class. So Between the Rivers is a relatively hard to find. I can loan you a copy if you need.
With respect to your question about the timing behind it, there are the Puranas, there is the Vedantas that predate, and a lot of Tamil literature that predate the Iliad and the Odyssey for maybe 1,000 years, where characters, at least what's in the book, seem to be extremely self-aware. They don't seem to be directed by the gods, and so and those are just books, and they talk about an ancient time. One of the first lines in the Puranas means old. That the meaning of Purana means old.
Yes.
So that says in the ancient times. It even talks about a time way before them, and that's how it starts. And it describes people, and it says that women always chose their spouses. So not like the modern days, which is when the book was written, when the things had, the role of the sexes had changed. It was lamenting the time, and it was actually glorifying a time when women used to choose their husbands. So, so if you wanted to, you mentioned the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah.
But there are texts way before that. Maybe there was in the East, perhaps, where it was codified, And so, something to think about,
This isn't a question for the panel, but there have been a lot of interesting books thrown out during this discussion, and I haven't taken notes. So
You have to watch the video again later.
will there be a compiled list at some point?
George has already got
I'll
a
take a
lip
shot
guide.
at it.
George already has a lip guide.
I'm a librarian. I actually have a list, because I got questions like that a few years ago, like what books would you recommend? So I went home and I made an annotated bibliography. I only have one copy. If you come up and give me your email, I'll write it down and I'll send you a copy of it.
Also, I just want to plug Coursera. I don't know if you guys ever look at the online, but there's one called The Journey of the Universe. It's 3 courses at Yale. It's very much the Desjardins consciousness, convergence kind of stuff. But there's an awful lot of amazingly good philosophy and philosophy of science on courses that are either free or sometimes they're $49. But it can be a really good way, in addition to listening and reading books, a good way to kind of really stretch your mind in a wonderful way, which is the source of freedom for all of us and peace.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
For coming. Thanks, panelists. Yeah, I guess that's it. Unless there's any more.
When's the next group
I don't
of
do the
students coming
difficult
in?
thing to
Begin at the
organize.
beginning.
What?
It's a difficult thing to organize.
Yeah.
Because of the topic, etc. It's not, it's not like some, okay, I made a new desalinator that can separate salt from seawater, and there'll be huge crowds, right?
Origins of consciousness.
There you go.
Simple.
If you guys like